I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-creating curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Time for Teachership podcast. This is episode 246, and we just revamped the website, so I'm going to read directly off of our newly designed website, which you can find at lindsaybethlyons.com. One-off workshops do not create meaningful change. Continuous learning and iterating with feedback from students, peers, and coaches does. So I'm going to go in this episode through a Google Doc template I've been working on to support teacher teams to continue work after initial workshops on a pedagogical approach or strategy, calling these group implementation coaching sessions, and join us for this conversation. Here we go. I first want to acknowledge kind of all of the folks who have informed this work. So this Google Doc template has been a work in progress for a couple of years, and there are so many folks. We never do this work alone. There's so many folks who have influenced it. So one, want to shout out the PLC at Work folks. So July 2024 on our podcast, we did a mini series on PLCs. So folks like Dr. Anthony Mohammed, Dr. Chad Dumas, super practical work of Bob Sanju, Maren Powers, and Shailene Miller were super effective in kind of helping me think about what really needs to happen. So certainly these are PLCs, a little bit different from like an implementation coaching model or a more kind of informal process. They certainly, want to clarify like what exactly PLCs are and how they are distinct from other conversations. But that was hugely impactful. Also, the GROW model, Better Lesson as a company introduced me to this. Roman Bertrand, who is in episode 1, the very first episode of the Time for Teachership podcast, has taught me a lot about coaching, one-on-one coaching, group coaching, coaching coaches, all sorts of things related to coaching, and how to use this model in others. So that has been really helpful, and I want to shout him out specifically. The field of positive psychology has been very influential in my approach as I learn even more from education scholars who talk about asset-based education, as well as the Values in Action website, which I find a very valuable resource to think about values and values really how they come into play in our teacher lives and are kind of feeling aligned to our values as we make pedagogical decisions. So you'll see that definitely in this, or you'll get that vibe. Also want to name a few recent books that have been helpful. So Street Data, as you know I love, from Drs. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan, as well as the more recent Pedagogy's Voice book from Dr. Shane Safir, Marlo Bugseek, Dr. Saswan Jabbar, and Crystal Watson. Super helpful to kind of think about things like just orienting to the margins, to think about how we're focusing on equity and we're centering like human connection. Also, Zaretta Heyman's latest book, Rebuilding Students' Learning Power, Teaching for Instructional Equity and Cognitive Justice, I'm really giving you a reading list here, has really helped me to think about things like in the Looking at Student Work protocol I've talked about before from DESE, questions you'll see in this like, are we over scaffolding? Do we want to just try to make the task easier and thus not grade appropriate? Or are we really coaching students to own the tools, use them themselves, and really expand their own learning power? Ideally, that one. Also, inquiry pedagogy, which I've really been informed by and through the investigating history curriculum out of DESE and colleagues I've worked with on that, as well as you'll see a visual of a framework, which is currently still in development, hopefully to be published in coming years with Kara Pranikoff and Dr. Eric Soto-Shedd. So with all of that, let's get right to what exactly is this template? What does it consist of? What are the different parts and kind of the why? So here it is. The first meeting, really thinking about a couple things. From the asset-based lens, we are thinking about identifying team strengths. We also, before any of this, I do want to say, we also want to get really clear on how to pronounce everyone's name and what their roles are. So there's certainly a space for that.
But we want to leverage our strengths as a team and or as individuals, right? So we want to make sure there's space for that. We also want to identify our values, both again, as a team or as individuals, but those things are really important and they're going to be a place we return to when we're stuck in like a challenge mode, right? Like we're stuck on this thing. We're in kind of scarcity mindset. How do we leverage our strengths? How do we feel aligned to our values? If we're between two decisions, how do we make sure we're aligning with the one that is values-based? We also want to hold on to equity and what I'm calling critical hope, really making sure that our focus is on the margins. So again, borrowing from street data and pedagogies of voice texts, which students are there in the margins right now, and how do you know what information is telling you this, right? Getting very clear on if we're talking to anybody, we're talking to this group and we're trying to seek equity and justice for this group. That is always kind of our centerpiece. I always find it to be helpful when coaching or when thinking through decisions to center a particular student or group of students and say, okay, what would work for them? Or let's get really specific. Yes, maybe this is the skill the class needs to grow, but what about this group? How do they need to grow it? In what ways do they have strengths, right? Or what way does the specific student have strengths that can be leveraged in growing that skill? It's super helpful to get very clear. And so to name the margins is really important. Also in the line of critical hope, thinking about the dream. So drawing on freedom dreaming and other things we talk about all the time on the podcast, getting really clear on the observable criteria and using that then as a metric for success as we move forward. So what is success? I would argue kind of, look/sound, but also feel like. What does it feel like to be in your classroom, right? What does success, look, sound, feel like? Get really clear on that and think about the ways to measure that. And that'll be an ongoing conversation. And finally, really thinking about inquiry and evidence. My social studies, teacher and coach mindset hat is on here, where we think about, let's co-design an inquiry question. This also comes out of pedagogies of voice, right? What is the thing we want to pursue and learn more about? Just even that language really centers the learning process here, as opposed to the traditional way of thinking about teachers as having all of the answers, right? Or that there is one right way, or that the right way comes from a particular place, such as peer-reviewed journals, versus co-constructed, informed by peer-reviewed journals, certainly, but also co-constructed with the kids in your class, right? And so again, that kind of points to the evidence. So what information will we gather to learn more? Certainly things like research, also things like let's ask the kids in the class, right? So thinking about inquiry and evidence is the final piece. This is really meeting one. And so meeting one is setting the stage, right? We're defining all of those assets. We're thinking about who we are as a team, what we believe in, what we're out to do. And then there is a coaching bank, both for that meeting and future meetings, that I put in just for my own self. I like to have a little coaching bank. You can certainly remove this from the template and have it as a one-pager or something and a physical copy, move it into a separate doc, whatever you'd like, if you want to, make your coaching doc public to the group. But I like to think about some coaching moves that are maybe hard for me to remember in the moment, or the languaging around the coaching move is hard. Certainly build your own here, add to this list, adjust as needed. But I think one thing that's been helpful for me as a coach is to clarify. So an example is like someone says, oh, students aren't really good at this thing, or I've tried this and students responded this way. It didn't work, right? And so my follow-up there is to get clear on what's going on. I might say something like, can you say more about that, or share an example? Like basically, how do you know? Let's get to the evidence. And what I find is that anytime we share an example, we get really concrete. Then I'm able to coach better. Often we have peer coaching because this is a group coaching situation. We have peer coaching tapping in. I recently did this in a workshop with about 10 educators in person. And it just like the example grew into a 10-minute conversation with minute, like detailed feedback from way more people than just myself, right? Like 3 or 4 or 5 people jumped in to offer clarifying questions. And we just got really into it. And it was so much more fruitful than leaving it at like, oh, this is a hard thing. How do I respond to this, right? Because that's so vague that it's really hard to coach on. And it doesn't illuminate the problem in the same way for that person that asked the question or made the comment about the challenge, or anyone else in the group, right? We want to get clarity as often as possible. So can you say more about that, or share an example is for me, a good go-to. The next thing is sometimes we're in a mindset that just is looking at a problem, maybe in like a deficit way, maybe in just like a way that doesn't feel productive, or like we've kind of gone around a bunch of times with ideas that haven't worked. Maybe we've tried a bunch of pedagogical moves and we're kind of getting the same result and we're just kind of feeling stuck. We might need to shift mindsets. So it might be, how might we think differently about this? So one thing that I've seen, particularly in inquiry pedagogy, is a frustration with students not having specific information about the time period of study in a history class, for example, or the people being studied, right? And so the concern is, if students don't have any, quote, background knowledge on this topic, they're not able to engage in inquiry. They're not able to have questions that are thoughtful or anything like this. And so one fellow coach who also coaches on an inquiry curriculum that I coach on just said this, and I wrote it down because I was like, this is so good. Curiosity in inquiry pedagogy is more valuable than background knowledge. And so just being able to kind of offer that as a reframe. So it might be a coaching question like, how might we think about this differently? But it also might be like, let's pause to think about the values or the priorities of inquiry pedagogy. Like, what skill is more important? Is it more important that they have memorized a bunch of information that they can recall? Is it more important that they are curious and they nurture that skill, right? I mean, ideally we have both, right? But to say curiosity is more valuable than background knowledge, I think is a really helpful reframe where we might have gotten stuck. But if we have this shift, then it's like, okay, well, then knowing that, how do we amplify curiosity? Now we're going in a different direction. We're not even trying necessarily to increase background knowledge, quote unquote. We are actually trying to do something different, which is to value, affirm, and encourage more curiosity, which is actually a completely different thing, right? So it just really shifts mindsets and directions. Relatedly, I think one of the most common mindsets that we can get stuck in is a scarcity one. We just never have enough time as teachers. That is so true. The response to this, or the best response that I coach myself on all the time, is a prioritization game, right? Like, it's not about not having enough time. No one has enough time. It's about how are we using the time that we have. So the question that's in response to the scarcity-based comment is, what is most important here, right? If you only have 30 minutes to teach this lesson, if you only have, however long to do X thing, what is most important, right? And that could be, what is the most important skill? What is the most important content? What is the most important way that you're making a kid feel? What is the most important based on like your vision of success that we defined at the outset? It could be a lot of things, right? But shifting from scarcity to prioritization as a mindset here could be really powerful. And then the final coaching move I added, and again, by the time you check this out, it may be different. I may be adapting or adding as we go, because nothing is ever set in stone, right? We're constantly learning and evolving. But the last one currently, as I record this, is aligning to values. So you could also use this to address scarcity and prioritization, but with which value or values is this pedagogy or this use of time most aligned?
Hi, this is Leah popping in to share the free resource for this episode, a group implementation coaching call template. You can find it at the blog post for this episode, www.lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/246. Now back to the show.
I believe and want to, encourage students to have more agency. I know they can, I believe in them, and I want this. Like, this is a core value for me, is like teacher as coach, or student agency, whatever the thing is, right? That is one of my core values. Or maybe it's, transparency. I want to be really honest and clear with students. I want to give them really clear feedback. However, to use time again, time is a constraint, or we have a curriculum that is set by the district and we need to teach that. So I don't have as much freedom to give students agency, right? Whatever the thing is, we are kind of imposed upon, whether it is a time restriction, a curriculum restriction. And we are finding perhaps that it's not really what we want. We want this thing, and we're being told to do this other thing. And sometimes those feel conflicting. And so just naming the competing commitment, or kind of the value that you think is displayed by your current use of time or the current pedagogical move, and like what you actually value, sometimes it takes kind of that deeper conversation to unearth, like, oh, I've been saying I'm all about student agency, and yet This is how I've been doing my lessons. I have been saying, talking at the kids and then asking them to do a multiple choice quiz. And then that's how I assess them. And then we move on, right? Versus, I actually, when I became a teacher, I really wanted student agency and I want to be able to invite them to, share in these multitude of ways, using multiple means of expression based on UDL. But all I'm asking them to do is this one thing that the curriculum says. Like, can I, for example, in that scenario, adapt or give multiple means of expression that answer the same question, but adapt the format to be student selected, still assessing the same skills and content knowledge, but enabling a wider range of options, right? Like, are there ways that we can align more closely to our values? Because we're not going to feel good if we're not values aligned in our teaching and in our pedagogy. Okay, so that's kind of the first meeting, the coaching moves that can be used in any meeting. And then I want to say after meeting one, here is kind of how I would structure this or have been trying to structure these things. One is to start with human connection. Pedagogies of Voice really reminded me of this. You might have a listening dyad. You might have a group check-in. You might have celebrations. I know the PLC at work folks are really good about naming celebrations as an opening. Again, asset-based, positive psychology. Let's bring it all in. And then we go to an implementation check. So you may name this something different, but basically a reminder that last time we said we were going to try this thing. We were going to gather this piece of data. Was it assessment data? Was it experiential student report data? Was it both from, X assessment or these particular students or from this survey, right? Whatever modality we're using. And then I kind of structured it into 3 groups. I think there's kind of 3 containers for this. One is like, let's honor the initial teacher reactions. And your teachers best. So there may be some moments where this doesn't quite work as well. Maybe if you open it up, it'll be really hard to get back to data. So like maybe you start with data, but I think for a lot of groups I work with, it's nice to be able to honor like what are your initial responses. And so I'm pulling from Dr. Frederick Buskey actually, and his brilliant daughter Mara, who do 5-minute coaching around 3 questions. I've reduced those to 2 here, because I think we get to the third and then the other parts. But kind of what went well, again, asset-based, and what surprised you? This question itself is kind of surprising and I think jogs us out of the typical glows and grows. Like, yeah, what was surprising? And what I read into that is like, basically, what did I learn, right? Because when you are surprised, you then have this like disorienting dilemma. I thought this, but actually this happened. Right? And then you have to make sense of that. So you are learning in that process. So it invites you to kind of think about what you've learned. Then I think reflect on the data. I like using something I've adapted from Panorama Education. I notice, I wonder, and I want to learn more about. So notice exactly what the data says. If a student said this particular quote in response to the lesson and they thought you should do this differently, I notice, quote, blah, 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 right? I notice X amount of students, how to do this, okay? And then I wonder, I like here to encourage yourself to think about, or the teachers to think about, 3 possible reasons why. I wonder if this comes from X, or this student said this because of Y, or this, trend in student data, this area for growth that I've kind of noticed comes from my pedagogical move here, right? Like try to think about maybe the why some of the noticings are happening. And then I want to learn more about, situates you firmly in the curiosity and learner stance. What information or perspectives are missing from the data you have is a nice kind of corollary question here. So basically, yeah, I want to learn more about this thing and thinking about where I'm going to go seek it out. Where am I going to go for more information to learn that thing? As in deeper reflection questions here that are pulled from Desi's looking at student work protocol that I really enjoy. So one, if you didn't get to it in the kind of the possible reasons why I wonder section above, it would be how did our instruction lead to the trends we saw in student work? So again, putting the locus of control back on the teacher, we are thinking about what we can do as professionals, as educators, right, to help students. So think about how did my instruction impact the thing I noticed in the data? And relatedly, how did the use of scaffolds that I put into that lesson, or maybe that already existed in that lesson, impact students' thinking and learning? So we're kind of interrogating some of that. And I kind of labeled this next question a gut check. But to what extent do you feel like you're wanting to make the task easier, like less hard, below grade standards, versus identifying tools and changes in pedagogy that would support all students in demonstrating mastery of a grade level task, right? I think that is the gut check. Like if we are defaulting to, oh, I'm gonna make it easier. I'm gonna add more sentence strips. I'm gonna, whatever, versus coaching students to use particular learner moves, right? I'm thinking of Zaretta Hammond here and the 5 learn to learn skills, or changing my way of interacting with students or my way of structuring the lesson, like then we're not really going to get very far, right? And we want to do that gut check to make sure that what we land on here before moving to the next piece where we're going to land on an action step is rooted in like good stuff, wanting students to be better learners and engaging with appropriately challenging grade level text, and me as an instructor being really the coach. So for the remainder of the meeting, this could be 30 minutes. It depends on how much time you have with teachers. I'm assuming around 60, some have 45, some have 75, around 60. So 30 minutes left, or 25 minutes left, I should say, if you did a 5-minute check-in. You have an adaptation of what I would say is the GROW model. That's how I initially started with this. I'm calling this GLEE at the moment. So goal, learn, explore, expectation. So what's the goal? What learning experiences do you hope to foster before our next session is a question that comes out of Pedagogies of Voice, I believe. And then thinking about like, I might have a lens toward like the content. I might have a lens toward the skill. I might have a lens toward how I want students to feel. Ideally, I'm thinking a little bit of all of this, right? But like we just looked at the data. We just noticed some things. And we're curious about, right? We have an inquiry pursuit here. We have our larger inquiry question for the year, but then we also said, I looked at this data and I want to know about this thing. So now, like, what are we trying to learn about? What are we hoping to foster? Right? I think you can change up the question. I'll probably play with that question for a bit, but like considering content, skills, and feelings, what's the thing we want to pursue before our next session? So again, returning to that learn, like what did we learn from the data? So let's get clear on like the assessment data. What are the student strengths and areas for growth? What's kind of like the biggest leverage points here for growth, and how can we leverage strengths in pursuit of that area of growth? And then what are our students actually saying? So what is the feedback that we got from them? Did we even ask them, right? And which students are we asking and hearing from? And then we move to explore. So this is usually going to be kind of the bulk of this second chunk or this 25-minute chunk. What instructional move could we use to grow the identified skill and at the same time enable student agency, right? We don't want to lose that student-centered learning agency. We want to grow the skill because we're coaching students to learn better, right? And so some options, there's like a bullet point kind of choice list here on the template. It could be that you're just saying, hey, you know what? Actually, my expectations were just not clear, right? If we're talking about a behavioral issue, for example, we might say, well, I was just not at all clear that I wanted this to be done in this way, or that our class discussion norms were never established at the beginning of the year. So of course that student was like talking over that other student, and that was kind of rude, right? Because we didn't have the conversation. So we need to actually, as a class, co-create discussion agreements, or we need to clarify expectations in some way. It could be that you want to introduce or use a learning tool. This could be a protocol. So, okay, I had an open class discussion, didn't have a discussion protocol. Kids were talking all over the place, or I only heard from 4 students that were the loudest, right? Next time, I'm going to introduce a discussion protocol. Or maybe I had a bunch of students who were quiet because I'm not sure that they fully kind of went through the information processing cycles. I'm going to use some of Zaretta Hammond stuff to coach on these learn to learn skills and introduce tools to them that can help their information processing so they're ready to go next time. Another option could be to adapt or design for engagement, representation, or expression. I link in the template to UDL here. And so there are so many examples. It is kind of overwhelming. But if you zoom into one of those, engagement, representation, or expression, you can do what we named earlier in the episode, where we're trying to, for example, open it up to multiple formats for ways to demonstrate your understanding of the content or your proficiency with a skill, right? That's an adaptation of a lesson if you have a set curriculum, or maybe you're designing if you're creating your own curriculum. It could be that you want to micro group, so you notice some trends in the data. Certain groups, right, have some strengths, right? You can kind of break the student groups or the class, into these little groups where like this group needs this intervention with this particular skill. This group actually got all of it and they need an extension, right? Whatever the thing is, it's like a micro MTSS system here. Or it could be that you want to think about how you're providing feedback to students. And so maybe what it is like you came up with all this great data and you're like, wow, actually, I don't know how I'm going to get that to students. I don't have a process in place to let them know what I just learned through this deep data dive in our group implementation coaching session. I need a better system for providing specific, timely, asset-based feedback to my students. And I'm going to figure that out in order to make that my next move, right? So that students, again, have the agency to get the feedback quickly, specifically, and then they choose what their next step is, which is reminiscent of my conversation with Dr. Asao Inouye, who says, the students are the ones that take the next steps. We don't, as the teacher, give them the next steps. We give them feedback and we facilitate kind of their information gathering so that they can choose, as writers, in his case, what to do next. Finally, we have the last piece, which is setting the expectation for next time. So what will we try as a group? Like, are we all doing the same thing? Are there some teachers wanting to try one thing, some trying another? This may vary. I don't have a set opinion on this. I think there are great ideas doing both. But then we want to know how we're going to learn from it, right? You're going to try the thing before next session when we meet in 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whenever the time is. So what are we doing? Getting really clear. Who is doing it? And what data are we gathering so that we can learn? And we're committing to bringing that back in the next session. So that was a lot. You can certainly, if you were driving, running, or otherwise occupied while listening, no need to have taken notes. You can certainly grab this free resource at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/246. And as a final thought, I'm going to return to what we said at the opening of the episode. Research from Joyce and Showers, 2022, shows that on average, teachers need about 20 practice instances to master a new teaching skill. And so their research actually shows teachers rarely transfer newly learned skills to the classroom unless training is accompanied by coaching. The percentage of teachers who accurately use new skills jumps from 5% to anywhere between 75 and 90% when coaching is included. I mean, that is wild. Such an important component of professional learning that often doesn't get as much financial commitment perhaps, or just like thought time than the typical show up in person PD for a PD day. I urge us to find small ways, peer coaching or otherwise, that we get teachers in spaces with other educators and get some feedback and get some shared data assessment practices or protocols in place so that we can then make decisions about what action we're going to take that is informed by the brilliance of the group and the great resources available to us in this wonderful age of education research and the internet. Until next time, everybody, have a wonderful day. Think big, act brave, and be your best self.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.